Crowds in Party. By Jodi Dean. Verso, 2016. Chapter 4. More than many. Many on the left think that the party is an outmoded political form. For them, what 68 inspired and 89 ostensibly confirmed is the conviction that radical left politics necessarily exceeds the constraints of the political party. Often voiced as a criticism of specific parties, the conviction that the party is useless for the left swallows up an array of historical particulars. The rejected Communist Party is not simply the ossified bureaucracy of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the other ruling party states of the former East. It is neither China's Communist Party, unable to free itself from its inner bourgeoisie, nor France's and Italy's compromised and complicit parties. It's the party form as such. Specific parties are rejected for errors singular or aggregate. They pushed for revolution at the cost of unnecessary violence and loss of life. They pulled back from revolution, selling out the working class and setting back the communist cause. Errors become evidence of the hierarchy, exclusion, and discipline irrevocably staining the party form as such, preventing it from being responsive to our changing times. Criticism of specific parties for the betrayals accompanying their acquiring of all participation in state power merges with a more general critique of the party as an ultimately authoritarian political association. The party is reduced to the actuality of its mistakes, its role as concentrator of collective aspirations and effects diminished if not forgotten. Consider the shift in radical politics marked by 1968 and characterizing key tendencies over the next decades. Leftists turned away from the party politics targeting the state and toward the social movements targeting society. This turn expressed itself in multiple ways. Indeed, multiplicity can be said to be its primary characteristic. Whether highlighting oppression based in sex and gender, exclusion anchored in race and ethnicity, the disciplinary mechanisms of institutions, university, church, family, union, party, clinic, patterns of hierarchy and organizations ostensibly committed to its abolition, the stultifying effects of bureaucracy, the deadening normativity of consumerism, or the overarchingly machinic character of militarized industrial life. The critical project at the end of the 60s was marked by the rejection of the state and the constitution of a new terrain of struggle at the level of the social. How to live freely and authentically became a, if not the, primary political question, one that state politics could not answer. Remarkably, the rejection of party and state cut across state socialist and capitalist societies, across East/West and North/South divisions. Whether the critique was issued from a liberal, democratic, feminist, socialist, anti-racist, anarchist, Maoist, or militant perspective, the underlying supposition was the same. Politics exceeds the narrowness of class and party, it thus requires turning away from the state and toward everyday life in all its unique specificity. 40 years later, the suppositions of this critique continued to frame left politics. Despite their otherwise acute differences, communist theorists such as Alain Badiou and Antonio Negri beat the same anti-state, anti-party drums. Radical democratic activists emphasize global summits and events, NGOs and CSOs, communities and the local. Militants refuse and subtract, as if nothing had changed, as if politics were a matter of the micropure, as if the setting of politics remained that of a centralized state and dominant party instead of a combined and uneven mix of centralizing and decentralizing forces in various distributed combinations of state use of market and market reliance on state. The left repeats a 40-year-old critique, as if its rejection of mediating institutions like the party did not serve capitalism's interest in preventing the build-up of the solidarity necessary for the collective power of the proletarianized. The problem with the left's entrapment in repetition is not the repetition. It's that the repetition prevents us from acknowledging how struggles at the level of the social come up against their limits in the state and market. David Ost's account of the Polish Solidarity movement provides the best political analysis of this encounter with the limit. Documenting the deep connections between the spirit of 68 and the Polish movement in the 70s and 80s, Ost describes its goal of a permanently open democracy, a political field irreducible to the oppositions between state socialism and market liberalism. Solidarity emerged as a postmodern anti-politics that deliberately abjured state power, seeking instead the strengthening of citizens in civil society. A left politics outside the party, Solidarity appeared as a fascinating experiment in a new political form, as Badiou puts it. What Ost makes clear is that the movement became irrelevant the moment it succeeded. Legalization, official recognition of an organization by a monopolistic state, was unavoidably an encroachment on that state. There was no way that Solidarity could pursue its program of societal democratization without touching state power, as it realized shortly before the December 1981 crackdown. Slavoj Žižek makes an analogous argument with respect to capitalist societies. Anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, and other such social politics founder against the hard rock of the market. Quotation by Žižek. The domain of global capitalist market relations is the other scene of the so-called repoliticization of civil society advocated by the partisans of identity politics and other postmodern forms of politicization. All the talk about new forms of politics bursting out all over, ultimately resembles the obsessional neurotic who talks all the time and is otherwise frantically active precisely in order to ensure that something, what really matters, will not be disturbed, that it will remain immobilized. End of quotation by Žižek. Newness and experimentation, not to mention preoccupations with changes at the level of the individual and actions focused on media and culture, take the place of a politics targeting capitalism and the state, ensuring that they continue doing what they do. At some point, however, an encounter with the state or the economy becomes unavoidable as one or the other becomes a barrier to movement ideals. The fantasy of a politics capable of remaining focused on authentic social relations, a revolution in personal life, and flourishing cultural experiments occludes the legal and economic conditions that either make them possible or prevent their realization. The crowds, riots, occupations, and revolutions of the early decades of the 21st century are demonstrating that the rejection of the party is itself outmoded. As Jason E. Smith rightly points out, the question of the party form can only take place with reference to, and indeed from within the dynamics of, contemporary struggles. These struggles pose the organizational question of the party as they run up against certain impasses that recur with such predictable if dispiriting regularity. Confronting the challenge of generating, concentrating, and sustaining collective energies, political movement itself thrusts the problematic of the party back onto the terrain of left theory and practice. Quotation by Peter D. Thomas. It has been practical experience of the contradictory processes of left regroupment on an international scale, from reconfigurations over the last decade on the Latin American left, to the varying success of coalition parties in Europe such as Die Linke in Germany, Izquierda Unida in Spain, Syriza in Greece and the Front de Gauche in France, to the tentative emergence of new political formations across North Africa and the Arab world, that has firmly placed the question of the party back on the contemporary agenda. End of quotation by Thomas. Movement actors increasingly recognize the limitations of a politics conceived in terms of issue and identity-focused activisms, mass demonstrations that for all intents and purposes are essentially one-offs, and the momentary localism of anarchist street fighting. Thus they are asking again the organizational question, reconsidering the political possibilities of the party form. This chapter supports contemporary efforts to concentrate and intensify the international left by offering a theory of the party that emphasizes the psychodynamics of collectivity, the ways that our collectivity works back on us to make us more than many. I take up critiques of the party form contemporaneous with its emergence. The party is too centralized, too authoritarian. It's a form by which the few dominate the many. In contemporary left discussions, such critiques are often voiced as if they were new insights born of recent experience. They aren't. They were present already in the early years of working-class political movement. I focus on the most thorough version of the critique of the party as it appears in the work of Robert Michels. Michels's famous iron law of oligarchy applies not just to socialist parties. He extends it to democratic and anarchistic political formations as well. Political organization of any sort entails a gap between the few and the many. Rather than being constrained by Michels's analysis, I treat it as an account of the enabling conditions of political collectivity, a way to understand the effects of collectivity on the collective. No party, class, or collectivity is identical with itself. Each is ruptured by an irreducible gap. Drawing from Lacan, I use concepts from psychoanalysis to theorize this gap as a social link or space, highlighting the relation of transference. Transference lets us see the dynamic features concentrated in the space of the other. I close by putting my psychodynamic account of the party to work, illustrating it with examples from the Communist Party of the United States in the 1930s and deploying it in a critique of John Holloway's argument against taking power. My goal in offering a psychodynamic theory of the party is to dissolve the hold that criticism of the party form still has on the left, such that we can accept again the responsibility of political organization. The few dominate the many. Some current rejections of the party say its time has passed. Maybe at one time such a political form made sense for radical politics, some concede, but now is not that time. This rejection errs when it proceeds as if the critique of the party was something new, a response to objective changes in the mode and relations of production. The mistake is one of omission. Left criticism of the party form is in fact coextensive with the emergence of working-class political movement. From the beginning, socialists worried about their organizations becoming centralized and authoritarian, and hence alienated from actual proletarian struggle. The First International, the International Working Men's Association, which lasted from 1864 to 1876, split between the followers of Marx and the followers of Bakunin. Bakunin rejected the inclusion of a political plank in the platform of the IWA, specifically the assertion that the conquest of political power is the first task of the proletariat. Contra Marx, Bakunin emphasized the subordination of politics to the struggle for economic emancipation. Solidarity with respect to economic demands had to come first, the federations and sections of the international left free to decide the political question autonomously. On the one hand, Bakunin's argument is pragmatic, because workers were coming together in struggle against capitalism, the insertion of political questions could make unity harder to achieve. On the other, the argument is rooted in a more fundamental rejection of statism. Bakunin rejects Marx's political plank because he associates it with a strong state. In Bakunin's words, Marx's program is a complete network of political and economic institutions rigidly centralized and highly authoritarian, sanctioned, no doubt, like all despotic institutions in modern society, by universal suffrage, but nevertheless subordinate to a very strong government. To quote Engels, Marx's alter ego, the autocrat's confidant. Bakunin views the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat as no different from any other statism under which the few would dominate the many. For him, the political struggle, and its organizational form, is at best subordinate and at worst antithetical to the economic struggle of the working class. Rosa Luxemburg transfers to Lenin the criticisms of centralism and authoritarianism that Bakunin levels at Marx. For Luxemburg, the problem is not with the party or the political struggle. Although she is celebrated for the mass strike and although she well understood the ways workers' spontaneous initiatives could surge past their party's capacity for action, Luxemburg always presumes that the energy of the masses needs to be directed. The energy of the masses can swell and grow, but they can only avail themselves of their power through leaders, the executive organs of their will. Even when critical of the party for failing to keep up with the masses, Luxemburg remains committed to the party as the form for concentrating and organizing political power. Moreover, Luxemburg assumes the necessity of the division of labor in every socialist concern for technical reasons of efficiency, discipline, and order. Technical managers who know exactly what they are doing and give directions so that everything runs smoothly are indispensable to the socialist economy. So Luxemburg rejects neither leaders nor the party. She rejects what she saw as Lenin's particular version of the party. Writing in 1904, Luxemburg observes that the conditions of a highly developed bourgeois society that made the German Social Democratic Party organizationally possible are absent in Russia. Russia lacks the formal guarantees of assembly and press through which the masses can acquire political experience via participation in public life. Luxemburg points out that social democracy grew because Germany's bourgeois democratic conditions allowed for the direct and independent actions of the masses. A class-conscious proletarian vanguard capable of organizing itself into a party, the heart of the German social democratic experience, is simply not present in Russia. Russian proletarians are atomized and isolated, not yet having educated themselves through class struggle. The problem with Lenin, Luxemburg argues, is that he proceeds as if he could simply command a vanguard into being by concentrating all party authority in the Central Committee. Rather than grasping the ways proletarian consciousness changes in the course of struggle, Lenin mechanically subordinates the class to the party and the party to the Central Committee. The Central Committee thinks and decides, and everyone else carries out its commands. The few dominate the many. Continuously repeated today, the charges of centralism and authoritarianism, the domination of the many by the few, are damning, striking at the very heart of people's struggle. If the few dominate the many, then working-class struggle merely replaces one set of oppressors with another. The very organization indispensable to people's political struggle stifles and deforms it. Charges of centralism and authoritarianism, however, have not been confined to socialist and communist parties or even to the party form as such. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, Michels levels these charges against democratic political participation most broadly. Democracy itself leads to oligarchy. The conditions that make democracy possible also make it impossible, whether one is talking about a polity, a party, a union, or a council, syndicate or Soviet. Michels's analysis, which I consider in detail below, reminds us that it is a mistake to proceed as if critiques such as Bakunin's and Luxemburg's, critiques repeated ad nauseum on the left, identify problems unique to Marxism or the party. On the contrary, we need to recognize them as attacks on mass, democratic, and people's politics more generally. The charge of the few dominating the many thrown about so vigorously on the left illuminates nothing specific to Marxism, Leninism, socialism, or communism. Rather, it points to the challenges of organization, duration, and extension that persist after the dissipation of the crowd. The gap of politics is unavoidable. Repeating the critique of centralism and authoritarianism time after time, in setting after setting, reinscribes fantasies of a politics without politics, fantasies of a beautiful moment when the many immediately know and realize their desire. To the extent that the left fails to recognize and take responsibility for the enabling condition of political collectivity, it will remain trapped in its own self-critique, unable to build or seize the organizations it needs. The Iron Law of Oligarchy. The best-known version of the argument that democracy leads to oligarchy comes from Robert Michels's Political Parties, originally published in 1911. A student of Max Weber's, Michels taught in Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. He was a member of the German Social Democratic Party, the Italian Socialist Party, and, later, Mussolini's Fascist Party. Lenin dismissed him as the garrulous Michels, disparaging Michels's Italian imperialism as just as superficial as his other writings. Social science treats political parties as a classic, even one of the 20th century's most influential books. Political Parties explores the nature of the party. Michels deduces the nature of the party via an analysis of the nature of the human individual, the nature of political struggle, and the nature of political organization. On the basis of this analysis, he posits an iron law of oligarchy or rule of the few. Unlike ancient Greek visions of democracy as the response of the people against oligarchy's owners of property, Michels construes oligarchy as intrinsic to democracy. Democracy, of any kind, tends to oligarchy. Democracy necessarily contains an oligarchical nucleus. So while political parties concentrates primarily on socialist parties, particularly the German Social Democratic Party, Michels's argument is broader, a political version of the Pareto principle or 80-20 rule. In any human association, the few will have more, whether this more is of goods, influence, or power, than the many. Parties one might most expect to incorporate rule by the workers in their basic structure, organizations animated by ideals of democratic participation, even groups with aspirations to anarchism, all ultimately take on a whole slew of oligarchical characteristics. Rule by the few is unavoidable. Michels surmises, the appearance of oligarchical phenomena in the very bosom of the revolutionary parties is a conclusive proof of the existence of immanent oligarchical tendencies in every kind of human organization which strives for the attainment of definite ends. Socialist parties and working-class organizations are not unique. They are representative, clear instances where oligarchical tendencies can be isolated and observed precisely because they conflict with party ideology. If democracy means rule by the many, democracy is impossible. Michels presents tendencies to oligarchy as technical and psychological. Technical tendencies concern the indispensability of leadership in groups. Psychological tendencies involve people's responses to leadership. They are effects of the fact of leaders back on the people. So there are tasks, means of accomplishment, and there are feelings about, responses to, and interpretations of these means of accomplishment. Both connect the party to the crowd. And both are matters of number, the problem and force of many, the complexity of mass organization, and the prestige accompanying that to which many adhere. Michels orients his account of the inevitability of oligarchy in a theory of the crowd reminiscent of Le Bon's. The crowd is suggestible, incapable of serious discussion or thoughtful deliberation, and susceptible to the influence of orators. Michels finds evidence of the crowd's incapacity in the fact that most people avoid going to meetings unless the event promises some kind of spectacle or someone famous is speaking. De-individuation is likewise a primary feature of Michels's version of the crowd. The individual disappears in the multitude, and therewith disappears also personality and sense of responsibility. And as we already learned from Le Bon, a crowd can go off in a panic or a flight of unreflective enthusiasm. It can be easily dominated, hypnotized, and intoxicated. Conversely, the crowd may be politically indifferent, hard to arouse, and a barrier to action. Number itself undermines direct democracy. 34 million people cannot carry on their affairs without accepting what the pettiest man of business finds necessary, the intermediation of representatives. The crowd, Michels argues, needs someone to point out the way and to issue orders. Tens of thousands of people can't deliberate together directly and immediately. Basic considerations of space, amplification, and the time, duration, and frequency of meetings, not to mention preparing the agenda and carrying out decisions, point to the unavoidability of delegation. So the crowd's very nature makes it vulnerable to oligarchy. Not only can it not protect itself from bold power seekers, but it relies on them. It needs leaders to get things done. It even enjoys them. Michels narrates the slide into oligarchy as an ersatz story of the fall as technical tendencies to an oligarchy come to dominance in a group. This story applies to every organization, whether party, union, or other kind of association. From an initial equality, wherein delegates are chosen by lot or rotation, gradual change sets in as delegates' responsibilities become more complicated. Quotation by Michels. Some individual ability becomes essential, a certain oratorical gift and a considerable amount of objective knowledge. It thus becomes impossible to trust to blind chance, to the fortune of alphabetic succession, or to the order of priority, in the choice of a delegation whose members must possess certain peculiar personal aptitudes if they are to discharge their mission to the general advantage. End of quotation by Michels. Demands arise for a sort of official consecration for the leaders. Leaders need to be vetted and trained, their expertise established. Accordingly, a system of examinations, and hence courses and schools, emerge. Educational associations produce elites with both skills for and aspirations to office. Michels concludes, without wishing it, there is thus effected a continuous enlargement of the gulf which divides the leaders from the masses. Even leaders originating from the masses become separated from them in the course of their acquisition of expertise, validation, responsibility, and experience. Although the division of the leaders from the masses is particularly vexing to socialist parties, syndicalism and anarchism encounter similar problems with oligarchy, again, for technical reasons. By syndicalism, Michels means that socialist current which would replace the duality of party and trade union with a completer organism synthesizing political and economic functions. This completer organism is the trade union reconceived as a revolutionary association aimed toward abolishing capitalism and establishing socialism. Syndicalists had been vociferous in their critique of the demagogic tendencies of democracy, whether in the German Social Democratic Party or in the trade union bureaucracy. Nonetheless, Michels argues, they also fall prey to the iron law of oligarchy. Leaders of any group can betray or deceive the rank and file, particularly in actions that involve secrecy and conspiracy. Strikes, whether economic or political, offer to men with a taste for political life excellent opportunities for the display of their faculty for organization and their aptitude for command. The strike, instead of being a field of activity for the uniform and compact masses, facilitates the process of differentiation and favors the formation of an elite of leaders. In effect, Syndicalists have an even greater technical need for leaders than socialists do. Anarchism, eschewing any form of stable or enduring political organization, would seemingly be immune from the problem of oligarchy insofar as there is no party hierarchy to climb or electoral office to seek. Not so, according to Michels. 3 features of anarchism bring it under the iron law. First, like the syndicalists, anarchists favor direct action, which favors the heroic self-assertion of the few. Second, anarchists recognize the necessity of administrative work, technical guidance of the masses, in the administrative sphere. Federations of councils and communes, even when comprised of purely voluntary associations, would acquire authority over time, thereby falling into oligarchy. Third, anarchist leaders have their own means of dominion, the same means employed by the apostle and the orator, the flaming power of thought, greatness of self-sacrifice, profundity of conviction. Their dominion is exercised, not over the organization, but over minds. It is the outcome, not of technical indispensability, but of intellectual ascendancy and moral superiority. Michels's point is not that there is something wrong with this dominion. It's that anarchism does not escape the iron law of oligarchy. The few are still more authoritative than the many. The larger the organization, the more powerful the leaders. For Michels, this is in part a technical tendency toward oligarchy, the challenge of organizing many. But it includes a corresponding psychological tendency as well, the psychic effects on collectivities of the fact of leadership. As we saw in Michels's story of the fall, a division of labor comes along with modern civilized society. In larger organizations, tasks become increasingly differentiated. Integrating them becomes complicated. Seeing the big picture becomes harder and harder. At the same time, voluntary organizations like unions and parties encounter constant turnover among their members. Members come and go depending on their stage of life. Are they young and more interested in love and adventure? Old, jaded, and burned out? Most people have what feels to them as better things to do than spend their free time in political struggle. But not all. Some, for varying reasons, attach themselves to organizational work. Some, particularly those who are paid and have acquired a vested interest in the organization, are more constant in their attentions to the group than are others. Those who are more constant and attached start to function as leaders. More than those whose engagement is temporary or sporadic, they know what the organization has done and is doing. They are the repository of organizational history, practice, and knowledge. Leadership can be less a matter of office than of the influence exercised by the regulars. As leaders emerge, the rank and file become less able to conduct or supervise the organization's affairs. They have to trust those to whom they've delegated the various tasks, perhaps instructing them to provide reports on the work of the group. Generally speaking, most people like it that way. Michels notes that the majority rarely participate. They leave meetings and discussions and organizational tasks to others. Though it grumbles occasionally, he writes, the majority is really delighted to find persons who will take the trouble to look after its affairs. This delight is an effective response, a shared sensibility, what we might call relief in delegation or the pleasure that arises from pawning tasks onto others. What matters for my argument here is the flow from the technical to the psychological tendency to oligarchy. Michels argues that the majority reveres or even adores their leaders. Accompanying the crowd's need for direction and guidance is a genuine cult for the leaders, who are regarded as heroes. So not only does the crowd need leaders for technical reasons, it is also effectively attached to them. Michels's account of this attachment is more suggestive than precise. But a decade before Freud, likely due to the influence of Le Bon and Tard, he cites both. Michels anticipates key elements of Freud's crowd psychology. The first is a primitive love. Michels attributes to the crowd the lofty moral quality of gratitude to the leaders for working on its behalf. He observes that leaders ask for gratitude as their reward for service and that the mass regards gratitude as a sacred duty. Re-election or long-term support for party leaders displays this gratitude. At the same time, Michels describes an attachment to leaders exceeding the sense of obligation for services rendered. This attachment is an atavistic survival of primitive psychology. Invoking the British anthropologist James George Frazer on myth and political power, Michels finds a latent superstitious reverence even for socialist leaders. It reveals itself by signs that are barely perceptible, such as the tone of veneration in which the idol's name is pronounced, the perfect docility with which the least of his signs is obeyed, and the indignation which is aroused by any critical attack upon his personality. He gives the example of Ferdinand Lassalle's appearance in the Rhineland in 1864. Lassalle was received like a god. Garlands bedecked the streets, maidens threw flowers, the crowd overflowed with irresistible enthusiasm and frenzied applause. Nothing was lacking. Michels notes that this fanatical devotion is not unique. Masses everywhere, in industrial as well as agricultural regions, England as well as Italy, need to pay adoring worship. They exhibit, Freud might say, a horde mentality. At times the masses' veneration of their leaders takes the form of an imitative mania that can grow into absolute idolatry. Gratitude and reverence are not the only feelings that adhere the crowd to its leaders. The crowd's admiration also stems from prestige and identification. The prestige of celebrity influences the crowd. Michels invokes Dard, noting the way fame impresses with the number of admirers. Prestige is like fame insofar as it incorporates the views of many. It's a matter less of talent than of the esteem held by the crowd. Even as the crowd responds enthusiastically to great orators, it responds even more to the enthusiasm of others, to others' feelings and responses. These responses indicate the greatness of the oratory, not its content. People adhere with and to others in common admiration. One admires the leader because others do. When celebrity influences us, Michels explains with a quote from Dard, it is with the collaboration of many other minds through whom we see it, and whose opinion, without our knowledge, is reflected in our own. Unconsciously, we see through others. We take the perspective of the many. Our seeing is collective. This seeing through others gives us a way to understand imitative mania. The object being imitated is not a specific person but prestige itself, the present presence of the many, crowd, or mass. Lacan reminds us, whenever we are dealing with imitation, we should be careful not to think too quickly of the other who is being imitated. Imitating a leader or celebrity, the many act for each other, showing themselves in their admiring enthusiasm to themselves, making themselves the objects of their own collective gaze. When fans dress up as characters in a movie to attend a movie's opening, as with the Harry Potter or Star Wars movies, or when they go in costume to fan conventions, they are doing it for each other. As they see themselves seeing themselves, they demonstrate the contingency and replaceability of the revered leader. Any one of those imitatively adopting the leader's characteristics is in the leader's place. Imitative mania, then, demonstrates the collectivity distorted in the pathology of absolute idolatry. The point of imitation is not the adoration of one, of a leader or celebrity. It is that the one is nothing but the thing enabling the many to experience its collective force. Enthusiasm arises out of this experience of collective imitation because the collective feels itself amplified, strengthened. Enthusiasm is nothing but this collective sense of collective power. In imitative mania, what is being imitated is not a person, it is prestige, the regard of the collective. Identification is similarly unconscious. Michels observes that a powerful speaker can hypnotize the crowd to such a degree that for long periods to come they see in him a magnified image of their own ego. In responding to the appeal of the great orator, the mass is unconsciously influenced by its own egoism. Michels is ambiguous here, eliding the distinction between individual and crowd. Is his point that each individual separately identifies with the leader or that the crowd qua mass exhibits its own egoism? If the former, Michels loses the ability to say something about the crowd. If the latter, the speaker would be a vehicle for generating this other ego, this perspective capable of enduring, unconsciously, after the speech ends. The ambiguity, the slippage, affirms the latter point insofar as the speaker becomes an opportunity for collective force to exert itself. Just as the distinctions between technical and psychological tendencies to oligarchy blur into and reinforce one another, so do the distinctions between crowd and leader, mass and party. Each twists into the other. Each ruptures the other from within, preventing it from achieving self-identity. For example, Michels emphasizes the importance of detachments from the bourgeoisie aligning themselves with the proletariat and animating its class consciousness. These members of the bourgeoisie, philosophers, economists, sociologists, and historians help transform instinctive, unconscious rebellion into clear, conscious aspiration. quotation by Michels. Great class movements have hitherto been initiated in history solely by the simple reflection, it is not we alone, belonging to the masses without education and without legal rights, who believe ourselves to be oppressed, but that belief as to our condition is shared by those who have a better knowledge of the social mechanism and who are therefore better able to judge, since the cultured people of the upper classes have also conceived the ideal of our emancipation. That ideal is not mere chimera. End of quotation by Michels. Bourgeois detachments, as a matter of fact comprising the majority of European socialist leaders, serve psychological as much as technical purposes. They enable workers to reflect on themselves, they provide a standpoint from outside the workers that workers can take toward their own condition. This perspective that comes from without is also generated within the workers' movement. Leaders come from among the workers, pushed up involuntarily by chance and circumstance. Michels quotes Le Bon, the leader has usually been at one time the led. Party work can separate the worker from the class to the extent that party functionaries are paid, and hence have a new source of income, to the extent that they acquire goals specific to the activities of the party, and to the extent that prestige attaches to leaders, the functionary is felt to stand for the many. Michels uses the party newspaper to illustrate the point. The editorial "we," uttered in the name of a huge party, has a much greater effect than even the most distinguished name. The article or editorial is no longer linked to a single person. It is backed by the force of a collective to which it gives voice. Michels concludes, who says organization, says oligarchy. Political enthusiasm, the joy of self-sacrifice, the thrill of struggle, inspires the crowd, but it can't endure. The crowd disperses and people go home. Keeping the fight alive requires dedicated, professional cadre, a few who devote themselves to the cause. This very requirement separates the few from the many. The Socialist Party is not identical with the working class. Workers are not automatically socialists and socialists are not necessarily workers. The party can have bourgeois and working class members, not to mention other classes. These members may be active or not, leaders or led. The class fragments into various interests, personal as well as political. Michels writes, the party, regarded as an entity, as a piece of mechanism, is not necessarily identifiable with the totality of its members, and still less so with the class to which these belong. The party is more than the sum of the particular interests of its members. The very non-identity of class and party, the gap between few and many, produces something new. We have hints about this something new in the ideas of prestige, identification, and that exterior point from which the working class can reflect back on itself. These ideas suggest that the party is a psychic space irreducible to its members and excreted out of the technical needs it fulfills. Michels recognizes this space, marking it with the party program. He writes, a party is neither a social unity nor an economic unity. It is based upon its political program. The program sets out the party's principles, ostensibly providing the missing point of unity in the idea of the working class. To be sure, this theoretical unity cannot eliminate the more fundamental class conflicts that express themselves in the party. In practice, Michels observes, the acceptance of the program does not suffice to abolish the conflict of interests between capital and labor. Put more broadly, the collectivity incorporated in the party will always be in excess of, never fully reconcilable with, a particular interest. A degree of alienation, of non-identity, is ineliminable. The very fact of a party, or any few carrying out some kind of organizational work, exerts a force counter to personal desire. If personal desire were enough, if it could simply be aggregated into happy outcomes, if the crowd had the capacity to know and get what it wanted, leaders wouldn't emerge. But the gap is irreducible, a repetition in the party of the antagonism rupturing society. Mind the gap. Psychoanalysis helps us understand this gap. It can let us see why the division between few and many should not be solidified as a division between real and ideal, pragmatic and utopian, but acknowledged instead as a constitutive, enabling split. Impossibility is the condition of possibility for communist politics. The non-identity between people and party is what enables each to be more and less than what they are, for each to enable rupture and exceed the other. Michel specifies this gap as the crowd's missing capacity supplied by the leader and the working class's missing consciousness supplied by the bourgeois deserters. Acknowledging that these technical provisions remain incomplete, that organization is more than an instrument, he supplements them by attending to the psychological tendencies of crowds. As gratitude, prestige, imitation, and identification demonstrate, leaders are means through which the crowd can feel and enjoy itself. Michel's own gestures to the unconscious thus provide an entry point for psychoanalysis. Lacan associates the Freudian unconscious with a gap where something happens but remains unrealized. It's not that this something is or is not there, that it exists or doesn't exist. Rather, the unrealized makes itself felt, it exerts a pressure. The Communist Party is a political form for the press of the unrealized struggles of the people, enabling the concentrating and directing of this press in one way rather than another. That the subject of politics is collective means that its actions cannot be reduced to those associated with individual agency, actions like choice or decision. Instead, as Chapter 3 argues, the collective subject impresses itself through ruptures and breaks and the retroactive attribution of these breaks to the subject they expressed. The punctuality of the subject could suggest that it is only evental, only disruptive, utterly disconnected from any body, creation, institution, or advance and thus without substance or content. But this would ignore the persistence of the subject in the press of the unrealized. This persistence needs a body, a carrier. Without a carrier, it dissipates into the manifold of potentiality. Nevertheless, with a carrier some potentiality is diminished. Some possibility is eliminated. Some closure is affected. This loss is the subject's condition of possibility, the division constitutive of subjectivity. Political forms, parties, states, guerrilla armies, even leaders, situate themselves within this division. Although they can be and often are fetishized, positioned so as to obscure the loss or perfectly remedy it, the fact of fetishization should not deflect from the prior condition of the gap and its occupation. The psychoanalytic concept of transference depends on and expresses this gap. In clinical practice, the transference involves the relation between the analyst and the analysand. What sort of feelings and effects are mobilized in analysis and to what kind of structure do they attest? For example, does the analysand want the analyst's approval? Does she want to seduce him, fight with him, obliterate him? Lacan acknowledges multiple ways of conceiving the transference, but rejects the idea that analysis proceeds via an alliance between the analyst and the healthy part of the subject's ego, an idea found in some American versions of psychoanalysis. This is a thesis, Lacan writes, that subverts what it is all about, namely the bringing to awareness of this split in the subject, realized here, in fact, in presence. The function of the transference in analysis is forcing the gap. Through the transference different unconscious agencies in the subject become manifest. As the analysand learns to attend to the transference, she can come to recognize and address the other within, the way, for example, a parental or social other has configured her desire. The transference is important for a theory of the party because of its function as a mode of access to what is hidden in the unconscious. The transference registers the effects of another beyond analyst and analysand. The analytic relation is not reducible to the interaction between them, it is the site of the appearance of another. Transference contributes to a theory of the party in this precise sense of a mode of access to what is hidden in the unconscious. The party is a form that accesses the discharge that has ended, the crowd that has gone home, the people who are not there but exert a force nonetheless. It is thus a site of transferential relations. Of course, the party is not an analytical session. Leaders and cadre are not psychoanalysts. This does not mean, however, that something like transference is not at work in the relation between crowd and party. In fact, Michel's emphasis on gratitude points to a transference effect, a love that, counterintuitively, underpins people's adherence to the leaders of an organization. Michel argues that those who have felt like no one was fighting on their behalf generally feel gratitude toward their champions. We could add here the way that people in a group are often grateful to those who step up, do the work, and take responsibility onto themselves. The feeling of gratitude makes leadership appear like a kind of gift, but one different from that which the king bestows on the people. Rather, insofar as he is focused on leadership in democracies, Michel suggests a leadership that the crowd produces contingently out of itself to give to itself. These are the leaders toward whom people feel gratitude. Even a gift the crowd gives itself is not without cost. Zizek notes that for Lacan language is a dangerous gift. It offers itself to our use free of charge, but once we accept it, it colonizes us. The gift establishes a link between giver and receiver. Acceptance creates a bond. It binds the receiver to the giver. Gratitude signals the binding power of the link, the felt force of the relation between giver and receiver, the pressure that renders a gift more than an exchange. What matters, then, is this link that is an effect of the gift and the force that it exerts. The gift constitutes a sociality that itself makes demands on us over and apart from those of the giver. Lacan refers to this sociality as the other or the symbolic. The transference reveals various components of it, unconscious processes and perspectives contained within the other. The space of the other is a crowded, heterogeneous space, a mix of shifting feelings, pressures, and attachments. It has structural features, dynamic features, processes that advance and recede, flow into one another and shift in importance. Multiple, different figures inhabit and inform these structures and processes. Features of this other space that Lacan highlights include the ideal ego, the ego ideal, and the superego. As Zizek explains, Lacan gives a very precise inflection to these Freudian terms. Quotation by Zizek. Ideal ego stands for the idealized self-image of the subject, the way I would like to be, the way I would like others to see me. Ego ideal is the agency whose gaze I try to impress with my ego image, the big other who watches over me and impels me to give my best, the ideal I try to follow and actualize, and superego is this same agency in its vengeful, sadistic, punishing aspect. End of quotation by Zizek. The ideal ego is how the subject imagines itself. The ego ideal is the point from which the subject looks at itself. And the superego is the judge that torments the subject as it points out its inevitable, unavoidable failure to achieve either of these ideals. These 3 points are tied together. The ego ideal verifies the image of the subject. Since the ego ideal is supposed to provide this verification, the subject has certain investments in it. The subject needs the ego ideal for its stability or sense of autonomy. Because of this need, it is resistant to recognizing that the ego ideal is nothing but a structural effect and resentful of the ego ideal's simultaneous power and inadequacy. Moreover, in trying to live up to the expectations of the ego ideal, the subject may compromise its own desire. It may give up too much, which explains why the superego can exert such an extreme, unrelenting force. It is punishing the subject for this betrayal. While these features of the space of the other may appear individual, this appearing is nothing but a Freudian residuum. Not only are the features common, but they attest to the workings of collectivity that Freud encloses in the individual psyche. Such features operate in all collectives as groups compete with other groups as well as look at themselves from the perspective of other groups. Cities and nations, schools and parties all have self-conceptions formatted via the processes and perspectives of the other. The transference that takes place in psychoanalysis reveals 2 additional features of the other space, the subject supposed to know and the subject supposed to believe. These elements are configuring suppositions within the subject, structural features that the subject posits as supports for its desire. The subject supposed to know is the figure that holds the secret to desire. It knows the truth. God, Socrates, and Freud as well as institutional roles such as parent, teacher, expert, and priest can function as such a locus of knowledge for and of a subject. Consider, for example, the opening of an editorial in The Guardian by left journalist Paul Mason. Quotation by Mason. One of the upsides of having a global elite is that at least they know what's going on. We, the deluded masses, may have to wait for decades to find out who the pedophiles in high places are, and which banks are criminal, or bust. But the elite are supposed to know in real time, and on that basis to make accurate predictions. End of quotation by Mason. Mason literally presents the global elite as the subject supposed to know. Not only does the elite know the obscene truths of pedophilia and expropriation, but they know them as they happen, in real time, while the rest of us remain deluded. In fact, a persistent question following the economic crisis of 2007 to 2008 was why didn't the elite know? How come no one saw the crisis coming? Lacan writes, as soon as the subject who is supposed to know exists somewhere, there is transference. Analysis depends on transference. The analyst has to function for the analysand as the subject supposed to know. The analysand starts talking about her symptoms, doing the work of analysis, because she thinks that the analyst knows the truth, when in actuality it's her work that produces the truth. Analysis can end as the subject recognizes that the analyst doesn't know after all. Zizek introduces the subject supposed to believe as a more fundamental version of the subject supposed to know. Quotation by Zizek. There is no immediate, self-present living subjectivity to whom the belief embodied in social things can be attributed, and who is then dispossessed of it. There are some beliefs, the most fundamental ones, which are from the very outset decentered beliefs of the other. The phenomenon of the subject supposed to believe is thus universal and structurally necessary. End of quotation by Zizek. The subject supposed to believe refers to this unavoidable displacement of belief onto some other. Concrete versions include the maintenance of the fiction of Santa Claus for the sake of children or the positing of some ordinary person who believes in community values. Michel's description of those detachments of the bourgeoisie who join the proletariat provides another example. Through them, the proletariat believes that their situation is not just unfortunate. It is profoundly unjust. Zizek emphasizes the asymmetry between the subject supposed to know and the subject supposed to believe. Belief is reflective, a belief that another believes. He writes, I still believe in communism is the equivalent of saying I believe there are still people who believe in communism. Because belief is belief in the belief of the other, one can believe through another. Someone else can believe for us. Knowledge is different. That the other knows does not mean that I know. I can only know for myself. No wonder, then, that a frequent refrain in contemporary capitalist ideology is that each should find out for herself. Capitalism relies on our separation from one another, so it does its best to separate and individuate us at every turn. Institutions are symbolic arrangements that organize and concentrate the social space. They fix another, not in the sense of immobilizing it but in the sense of putting in relation the emergent effects of sociality. This putting in relation substantializes the link, giving it its force, enabling it to exert its pressure. A party is an organization and concentration of sociality in behalf of a certain politics. For communists this is a politics of and for the working class, the producers, the oppressed, the people as the rest of us. Party knots together effects of ideal ego, ego-ideal, superego, subject supposed to know, and subject supposed to believe. The particular content of any of these component effects changes over time and place even as the operations they designate remain as features of the party form. The ideal ego in communist parties is typically imagined in terms of the good comrade. The good comrade may be a brave militant, skilled organizer, accomplished orator, or loyal functionary. In contrast, the ego ideal is the point from which comradeship is assessed. How and to what end is bravery, skill, accomplishment, and loyalty counted? The party superego incessantly charges us for failing on all fronts. We never do enough, even as it taunts us with the sacrifices we make for the sake of the party. We have always done too much. Each of these positions can be varyingly open and closed, coherent or contradictory. Insofar as the party is situated in an antagonistic field, insofar as it is not the state but is a part, other ideals and injunctions enter the mix. This is class struggle within the party, the challenge presented by capitalist consciousness. At the same time, the situatedness of the party means that the space it provides necessarily exerts effects beyond party members, providing images and reference points for those who might join, for allies and fellow travelers, as well as for former members or enemies. The ideas of subjects supposed to believe and know are particularly useful for thinking about these effects beyond party members. Critics of the Communist Party chastise the party for claiming to know, for functioning as a location of scientific or revolutionary knowledge. This ostensible expertise has been derided not only as monopolistic but also as false. The knowledge of living with, responding to, and fighting against oppressive power belongs to the people and cannot be confined into a set of iron laws of historical development. Given this critique, which came to be widely shared on the left in the wake of '68. It's surprising that the collapse of the Soviet Union dealt such a mortal blow to communist and socialist organizing in the US, UK, and Europe. By 1989, only a tiny few defended the Soviet Union anymore. Most agreed that its bureaucracy was moribund and that it needed to institute market reforms. Why, then, did its collapse have such an effect? The subject supposed to believe helps make sense of this strange reaction. What was lost when the USSR fell apart was the subject onto whom belief was transposed, the subject through whom others believed. Once this believing subject was gone, it really appeared that communism was ideologically defeated. As a further example, we might consider the prototypical accounts of Communist Party officials with their dachas and privileges. These functioned less as factual exposes than as attacks on the subject supposed to believe. Not even the party believes in communism. Where the attacks failed, however, is in the fact that they were waged at all. Insofar as they had a target, they affirmed its ongoing function as the subject supposed to believe. The flawed, desiccated party could still believe for us. Once it utterly collapsed, we lost the other through whom we could believe. The party organizer. Writings from the 1930s in The Party Organizer, a publication of the Communist Party of the United States for the internal use of unit and district organizers, display the array of dynamic and structural effects knotted together in the party. A first example illustrates the intertwining of ideal ego and ego ideal in the party. The writer vividly narrates how his CP-organized block committee fought to get food relief for a needy woman and her children. As he tells it, the workers stood up like a solid wall, demanding food. The cowardly relief supervisor, a capitalist tool, called the police, who rushed in and grabbed the CP organizer. But the roar from the workers and my determination to fight back put fear into the hearts of the police. The police called for reinforcements and brought the big fat Judge Mendrisky with them. With a heroic image of himself, workers, and party standing up to the capitalist relief supervisor, police, and judge and fighting to keep a woman and her children from starving, the organizer recounts, I looked right at him and said, "What the hell are you here for, to help this serpent deny this mother with her 3 children? You don't care, you with your belly packed with steak." The judge orders the police to lock up the organizer. But the police, seeing the determination of the workers, are forced to let him go. The workers appear as a crowd, a roaring steadfast wall. Their appearing compels the police to take the perspective of the CP and recognize that the united workers are stronger than any judge and his order. A second example brings out the superegoic dimension of the party. In the early 1930s, the party organizer filled itself with articles on how to recruit and retain new members. Month after month, the writers, many anonymous, many district-level organizers, express excitement about gains in new members and dismay over the party's failure to retain them. They worry that their meetings are too long, that they don't start and finish on time, that they aren't snappy enough. They advise one another on the best design for a party meeting, no more than 2 hours, not to exceed 2.5 hours, 3 hours at the absolute limit. District organizers are advised to pick up members at their houses and bring them to meetings. Members are reminded to talk to new recruits. The CP organizers writing in the magazine sense the enthusiasm and earnest desire of the workers, but blame themselves for the fact that the workers drop out. Quotation from the magazine. The recruit comes into the average unit of the party and finds there a group of strangers speaking a jargon which he does not understand. No one pays much attention to him and he is therefore left very much to himself. Enthusiasm cools, he becomes discouraged, loses his enthusiasm and finally drops out of the party. End of quotation. Jargon is a symptom of the problem. Jargon means that the people in the party are not speaking the same language. It marks a division between workers and party members, even when party members are workers. The language that members share, the ideas that enable them to see the world in terms other to capitalism's, enhance and hinder belonging at the same time. The very activities they pursue as communists, reading, discussing, meeting, leafleting, organizing, training, separate them from the workers. What makes them communists, what separates them from capitalism's constraints as it provides them with political capacity and conviction, inscribes a gap in the givenness of economic belonging. They are not just economic producers. They are political producers creating not commodities but collective power. One recommendation for overcoming this division is imagining oneself as a comrade, not a professor. Organizers are advised to speak not as a soapboxer or a seasoned communist theorist but just to be one of the workers, which indeed you are. Other recommendations include better development of cadres, more effort at education. Still others highlight a kind of transferential relation that can arise from visiting the workers at least 2 or 3 times a week, getting to know them by name and their individual problems, and have them call you by name and feel you are one of them. Imagining oneself as a comrade, particularly when accompanied by instructions to do what one would normally do, involves a reflexive turn on to the everyday as one looks at what one does from the party perspective. The same desire that leads people to join the party separates them from the crowd. Once they have become communists, they see themselves and the world from the perspective opened up by the party. They look at the world differently from how they did before. Yet they also have to continue to imagine themselves as the workers they are, bound to the economic struggle. Hence the advice, little by little from the conditions in the shops go on to the speed up, wage cuts, unemployment and then to the need for organization. Don't appear too insistent at first. The organizer has to begin from the perspective of the worker and guide the worker to a shift in perspective, to seeing from a different place. The superegoic dimension of the party is inseparable from its capacity to provide an ideal ego and ego ideal. The internal criticisms that the party organizer raises are unrelenting. For every success in increasing membership, there is an injunction to do more, to do better. One article will take up the ways problems are being addressed. The next will hammer home the problems that persist. The demands they place on themselves never let up: another membership drive, more focus on the trade unions, intensification of reading, more thorough reporting. They acknowledge small victories, but every victory, in true superegoic fashion, inspires yet more self-criticism. One writes, "Our influence among workers has increased tenfold within the last few years, but the membership of our party has remained practically stationary. Why do the workers come and leave our ranks? What is wrong with us?" Throughout 1932, the conversation in the party organizer, particularly in the section on mass work, centers on concentration in the shops, concentration in the neighborhoods, concentration in the stockyards of Chicago. Concentration is approached from different angles, the emphasis on subjective factors explained in light of objective factors. By February 1933, critical reflection turns round upon concentration. In concentration, a means of winning the workers in the key industries, J.P. observes that concentration has become a party term. We concentrate feverishly. But the formality and sectarianism of the approach to concentration has become itself the problem, the actual barrier to growth and increase. The party has had the wrong conception of concentration. What is necessary is more intimate contact with the workers. 6 months later, a disgusted party member laments, "We have never taken concentration seriously." The party organizer reveals a party in the process of exerting pressure on itself, of imagining itself and struggling as it produces a place from which to see itself. This place is in flux, unstable, sometimes occupied by idealized revolutionary workers and sometimes the place from which workers are idealized. The stronger the party feels itself becoming, the fiercer and more intense the demands it puts on itself. A letter from an active party comrade in Chicago expresses the pressure of the relentless injunction to do more. Quotation from the letter. "I will be criticized next Tuesday night at the organizers' meeting because the unit is not larger, because I have not done more, because I did not attend some meeting or other. I do the best I can. However, no matter how much I do, I always hate to show my face because there are things I do not do that I was told to do. Directives, directives, directives. An organization letter sometimes of 3 pages. Hell, I could not do 1/10 of it. I am getting tired. I am just as much a communist as ever, but I am not 10 communists." End of quotation. Zizek observes that the symbolic space of the other operates like a yardstick against which I can measure myself. The communists appearing in the party organizer measure themselves as many. The desire that expresses itself in the urgent demands they make on themselves is collective, 10 communists, even as it is felt as impossible superegoic command. Political organization and its discontents. Thus far I've emphasized the psychodynamics of collectivity. Whereas critics of the party tend to fault the form itself for its centralism and authoritarianism, I've used Michel's discussion of the technical and psychological tendencies to oligarchy in any political group to assert the unavoidability of a gap between few and many. Organizing crowds involves division, delegation, and distribution. Number, being many, has effective force, as we see in prestige, imitation, and identification. Further, I've drawn from psychoanalysis to theorize the gap as a link, a social space knotting together unconscious processes and perspectives. Inserting the party in this gap, I've shown collectivity's work back upon its members. Their very association alienates them from their setting, opening up the possibility of another perspective on it and separating them from how they are given under capitalism. To be sure, that political organization means a gap between many and few is unavoidable does not imply that the same people should be on one side or the other of it. The history of people's struggles, anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, etc., demonstrates profound and ongoing mobilization on precisely this point. Likewise, that the gap is unavoidable does not imply that any given instantiation of the gap is permanent or justified. There are better and worse parties and leaders. Some are more faithful to the crowd's egalitarian discharge than others. And Michel's own discussion brings out the torsion between many and few as power shifts and folds between them. What appears as an idolized leader is a refraction of the crowd's enjoyment of the power of number. Finally, that the gap between many and few is unavoidable does not mean that gaps should line up with each other. Doing more work should not imply garnering more material benefit. In sum, the crucial point that follows from the unavoidable gap between few and many is that the charges of centralism and authoritarianism leveled at the Communist Party from its inception in fact apply to politics as such. If we are to engage politically, we cannot avoid the effects of number. To think that we can is to persist in the fantasy of the beautiful moment. The utility of my psychodynamic approach to the party becomes clear in contrast with John Holloway's well-known attempt to imagine a revolutionary politics aimed at abolishing power altogether, a name shared by most anarchists. Published at the beginning of the 21st century, Holloway's influential account anticipates the post-anarchist converging of post-structuralism and anarchism. It also repeats century-old criticisms of the party form, updating and distilling these criticisms into a concentrated rejection of power per se. Variations on Holloway's arguments against the party for its state-centrism and externality to the working class appear today as a kind of common sense throughout the radical left. Holloway orients his vision of politics in a notion of doing as the movement of practical negativity. Doing, for Holloway, goes beyond the given, and hence is akin to the gap I associate with the work of collectivity back on itself. Embedded in the flow of human movement, Holloway's doing is likewise necessarily social. There is a community of doing, a collective of doers, a flow through time and space. But insofar as his collective doers are nothing but flows through time and space, their collectivity exerts no effect back upon them as a collective. Holloway's collective is at best a crowd. At worst it is nothing more than mobile social substance. It can split a field, produce a gap, but it has no place from which it looks at itself. Lacking reflexivity, the sociality Holloway describes as a sociality without sociality. He comes close to acknowledging this omission when he says that this collective doing involves, if the collective flow of doing is recognized, a mutual recognition of one another as doers, as active subjects. Our individual doing receives its social validation from its recognition as part of the social flow. People recognize one another, in relations imagined as multiple dyads, exchanges of recognition. Yet the role of the other as the field of social validation remains unremarked. It has no effects or dynamics of its own, no impact apart from the acknowledgement of individuals. Holloway's flow of doing, in other words, omits the function of the space of the other. Holloway nevertheless presupposes such another space when he criticizes the party for its externality to the working class. In the Marxist tradition, he argues, the failure of workers to revolt is explained with notions of ideology, hegemony, and false consciousness. All three are accompanied by an assumption that the working class is a they. Holloway claims that the problem of communist organization is how can we make them see? We see clearly. They do not. Holloway's mistake consists in the way he presents division as if it were a division between groups, workers on one side, party on another, rather than a division constitutive of political subjectivity, of the gap necessary for the subject to appear. Seeing differently involves a reflective twist, a different perspective on where one is. Where one is has to appear other than how it was. There has to be a gap between the social flow, to use Holloway's term, and the political assertion of this flow. The problem is not externality, as if the party or the state were separate from and unaffected by society. The problem is the perspective from which something appears differently. A strike can be a matter for the workers in a specific factory. It can also be politicized as a component of a larger struggle. Is a particular strike simply for higher wages so that individual workers can increase their capacities to consume? Or does it incorporate claims of fairness, equality, and right? Does it link itself to other such actions so that it appears as the struggle of a class? Holloway's critique of externality repeats the old charge of vanguardism leveled at the Leninist party. Holloway attributes to Lenin the view that the party is necessary because class consciousness can only come to workers from without. Lenin's ostensible error here is one of elitism. It comes from validating intellectuals over workers. Workers on their own lack the capacity to develop class consciousness. Intellectuals, however, have the requisite knowledge and skills. Daniel Bensed demonstrates that this argument is misplaced. Lenin's point is that political consciousness comes from outside the economic struggle, not the class struggle. The economic struggle takes place between particular interests within the field of capital. The terms of the struggle are set by capitalism. The political struggle, for communists, is over the field itself. When we is used as the designator for the subject of a politics, it asserts more than a collective will. It announces a will to collectivity, a will to fight together on terms that challenge rather than accept the given. Class consciousness is not spontaneous. As Zizek emphasizes, what is spontaneous is misperception, the perception that one is alone or that one's circumstances are unique. The political we of the party ruptures this immediate consciousness to assert a collective one in its place. Holloway extends his critique of the externality of the party to Georg Lukács. He charges Lukács with failing to explain how the party can adopt the perspective of totality. This charge, too, misses its mark. The party doesn't adopt the perspective of totality in the sense that it can and does see everything. Rather, the party tries to establish the space for a perspective on the totality, a perspective that is not determined completely by the setting in which it finds itself as if it had no impact on this setting. The party works to create the condition of possibility for a perspective that, empirically impossible, ruptures the openness of the capitalist manifold from within. Holloway takes direct aim at a Marxism viewed as a source of objective, scientific knowledge. Quotation by Holloway. If Marxism is understood as the correct, objective, scientific knowledge of history, then this begs the question, who says so? Who holds the correct knowledge and how did they gain that knowledge? Who is the subject of the knowledge? The notion of Marxism as science implies a distinction between those who know and those who do not know, a distinction between those who have true consciousness and those who have false consciousness. End of quotation from Holloway's Change the World Without Taking Power. The subject supposed to know is a structural position. The party doesn't know. It organizes a transferential space offering the position of the subject supposed to know. In Zizek's words, the authority of the party is not that of determinate positive knowledge, but that of the form of knowledge, of a new type of knowledge linked to a collective political subject. This form is that of a shift in perspective, a collective political position on a situation that had appeared limited and determined by capitalism. The perspective of the party comes not from religion, law, or individual insight but rather from the fact of collectivity, as I've been arguing here, from fidelity to the equality of the crowd discharge. Holloway asks how we can ever know whether those in the know are correct, how it is even possible for them to know. He is right to suggest that we cannot know this, there is no other who knows. His questions thus voice the end of a transferential relation to the party. In Holloway's case, however, the end of that relation to the party does not mean the end of transference. He mourns that the Leninists know, or used to know, the knowing of the revolutionaries of the last century has been defeated. Of course, Lenin didn't know. Lenin famously shifted positions and courses, bending the stick and responding to the movement of the revolution. Holloway's inability to acknowledge that Lenin was lucky, that he erred, that he changed his mind, that he did not know tells us that he, Holloway, remains attached to a position he can't not presuppose. The position is there, but loosened from the ties that inspired it, disconnected from the victories of people's struggles, pushed into the past as something left behind but exerting a force. On the one hand, Holloway recognizes that there is no other of the other, no guarantor of political knowledge. Political knowledge arises through practice, over time, in ways that remain unfixed and contingent. On the other hand, insofar as the position of the other remains, Holloway fights to keep it empty, to doubt any and all who might occupy it. Abandoning any connection between the substance of emancipatory egalitarian political struggle and the perspective this struggle creates, he insists on the not knowing of those who are historically lost, the not knowing of the defeated, as if nothing had been learned, as if there were no trace of past victories and achievements. Trusting none to bear the knowledge necessary for revolution, he asserts non-knowledge even as he resorts implicitly to vague supports such as the knowledge of intellectuals. What Holloway can't acknowledge is that the erasure of past victories and achievements is an effect of his own disavowal of the body that carries them, the party, a disavowal in turn of revolutionary power. Ultimately, Holloway's critique of the party follows from his rejection of the state. Reformist and revolutionary Marxists alike treat the state as the means through which society can be transformed. Holloway calls this an instrumental view of the state premised on the fetishistic idea that the state is separate from and external to society. Armed by this instrumental and fetishistic vision of state power, Marxists concentrate and direct radical energies toward its conquest. The party is the organizational form of this state fetishism insofar as it is abstracted from all other social relationships to appear as the primary object of political circulation. The party disciplines and impoverishes class struggle, subordinating its myriad forms to the overriding aim of gaining control of the state. When politics is channeled through the party form, political feelings, experiences, and relations failing to contribute directly to the conquest of state power are deprioritized, subordinated, rendered as lesser than. Holloway is right to say that the party is a form for disciplining class struggle, but he fails to consider what discipline means. For communists, discipline involves building solidarity, strengthening collectivity, and sustaining courage in the face of capitalism's efforts to isolate us in self-interest and fear. The instrumentalist impoverishment of which Holloway accuses Marxists is Holloway's own, apparent in his omission of the abundant life world of practices organized by communist parties everywhere. It prevents him from acknowledging the diverse activities involved in Communist Party organizing, activities such as establishing newspapers and literary journals, forming youth leagues and sports teams, building support networks for women's groups and racialized minorities. Once these multiple and varied activities are included in our conception of discipline, we see again the party as a social link, one that interrupts the imaginary and symbolic order of the bourgeoisie to insert egalitarian ideals and collectivist perspectives. Understood most generally, party discipline is nothing but establishing and maintaining this link. Benstead observes that Holloway reduces the luxuriant history of the workers' movement, its experiences and controversies to a single line of march of statism through the ages, as if very different theoretical and strategic conceptions had not been constantly battling with each other. What Holloway refers to as the subordination of myriad forms of class struggle to the goal of gaining control of the state has historically included an array of tactics and been carried out in multiple time frames. Tactics for winning the state span a wide range, from securing an electoral majority and participating in governing coalitions to organizing factories and neighborhoods into a counterforce, stretching the resources of the state until it collapses, subverting the state from within, violently overthrowing it and militarily invading it. These different tactics fold into one another, operating along different time frames with short-term and long-range goals and cutting across national and regional borders in fronts, alliances, rings, and pacts. Nothing about communist organizing presumes the externality of the state to society, much less the autonomy of the state from international political, economic, social, cultural, and environmental forces. A less reductive treatment of the communist revolutionary legacy would note how communist visions of the party as a means of waging revolution explicitly state, time and again, that revolution requires changing people, beliefs, and practices. Even crude treatments of historical communism admit as much when they attack as totalitarian 20th century efforts to create the new socialist man or a new type of human being. The focus on the revolutionary goal does not distance the party from everyday practice, as Holloway implies. On the contrary, revolution is an effective shared purpose. The goal is an instrument of its realization. A collective that has a goal and works to achieve it exerts power over itself. The production of the collective space of the party as a knot of transferential effects is the way people are changed through struggle, the way they induce a gap in capitalism where another perspective becomes possible. Members look at themselves and their interactions from the perspective of the association they create through their association, the party. The goal of revolution lets us see the reflective dimension of the instrument of revolution in terms of its effects back on those out of whom it arises. The party affects members, fellow travelers, opponents, and the general setting insofar as its knotting together of elements of the other consolidates the space of the politics, establishing a place from which a collective can look at itself. The party opening. Holloway claims that the party is historically closed to us now. Quotation by Holloway. Whether or not it ever made sense to think of revolutionary change in terms of the party, it is no longer even open to us to pose the questions in those terms. To say now that the party is the bearer of the class consciousness of the proletariat no longer makes any sense at all. What party? There no longer exists even the social basis for creating such a party. End of quotation by Holloway. Some on the left have become convinced of this point. They repeat it as if it were an obvious truth. It's not. What does it even mean to say that there is no social basis for the party? Some argue that changes in the social composition of labor and the capitalist mode of production have eliminated the industrial workforce necessary for a politics of the proletariat in the North and/or the West. Rather than acknowledging the historical importance of the peasantry in communist revolutions and parties, they presume a seemingly organic link between industrial worker and party as if factory organization automatically generated party organization or as if workers were naturally solidaristic. Part of the oddity of the claim that there is no social basis for the party is the way it inverts previous explanations for party identification. These explanations held that people join together in parties not because they already feel connected to others but because they don't. Individualism, isolation, and the need to belong motivate people to join together. The same effect, party belonging, is thus attributed to connectedness and isolation, a prior solidarity and a prior individualism. When critics of the party use socio-economic factors to support their claims for the obsolescence of the party form, they treat isolation, fragmentation, and individualism as explanations for their own continuation. Previous analyses, however, understood these as problems party belonging redressed. Nevertheless, something about Holloway's claim rings true. After all, if the party form were compelling now, wouldn't we see something like a party exerting a force on the contemporary left? His point that the idea of the party as the bearer of working-class consciousness no longer makes any sense at all has an element of truth. But what is this element? As he positions Leninists as the subject supposed to know, Holloway implies that there was a time when the party was the bearer of working-class consciousness. There was a time when people, workers, peasants, intellectuals, even capitalists, believed that the Communist Party was the bearer of working-class consciousness. More precisely, they believed that others believed that the Communist Party was the bearer of working-class consciousness. In the second half of the 20th century, this belief collapsed. The slogan from the Cultural Revolution makes the point most powerfully: the bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party. This is the element of truth in Holloway's claim that it no longer makes sense to think in terms of the party. Few today believe that the Communist Party is vanguard of a revolutionary working class. The assumption that revolutionaries used to know, however, points to the continuation of transference. Holloway doesn't say that they never knew. He doesn't say that the party never was a bearer of working-class consciousness. The space opened up and held by the party remains. It's as if the party's form as enigmatic subject support persists even as the working class no longer appears as a revolutionary subject. Such a support continues to exert an effect even in the claim that the bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party. The claim is reflexive. It is the party itself that opens the space for this criticism of itself. The party holds up the subject making this criticism, a point Holloway attempts to disavow but cannot not presuppose. He is right to say the party is not the bearer of working-class consciousness. In fact, it never could be the bearer of such a fiction, the efforts of German social democracy to present it otherwise notwithstanding. The party is the support for the subject of communism. This subject has been variously figured as proletariat, peasantry, and divided people. The party operates as the support for the subject of communism by holding open the gap between the people and their setting in capitalism. The more the gap appears, the more the need for and perhaps even sense of a party impresses itself. This gap isn't a void. It's a knot of processes that organize the persistence of the unrealized in a set of structural effects: ideal ego, ego-ideal, superego, subject supposed to know and believe, the party as the other space. This other space doesn't have its own interest, a correct line, or an objective science that tells it the truth of history. It is instead a rupture within the people dividing them from the givenness of their setting, a rupture that is an effect of their collectivity, the way their belonging works back upon them. Political experience shows that radical movements cannot simply avoid the state won't let them. It actively infiltrates, polices, and subverts them. To the extent that movements pose a serious challenge to state power, they encounter its reactive counterforce. That society conceives itself as a myth that has outlived whatever usefulness it might have had for the left and become visible as the instrument of the expansion of capitalism. Gaining political control of the state thus remains an important goal because the state presents a barrier to political change. As the political instrument of capitalist class rule, the state enforces order in the interest of capital as a class, doing all it can to prevent, redirect, and smash opposition. In the face of militarized policing, not to mention the evisceration of the social gains of working-class movement, does it make sense to envision a political revolution that ignores the state, allowing the state to go on exercising its policing, repressive, and legal functions? If we do not think that the state should remain in the hands that it is in, then we lapse into the politics of the beautiful moment when we fail to factor it into our political perspective. One might object that contemporary decentered, federated, and interlinked states are not in anyone's hands and therefore cannot be seized. This objection, however, implicitly endorses a liberal technocratic view of the state. It proceeds as if the systems of laws and assumptions on which states are based are nothing more than neutral protocols. The classic communist ideal of the dictatorship of the proletariat confronts this lie directly. The liberal state is in actuality the dictatorship of capital. Its premises ensure that the benefit of the doubt, common sense, falls on the side of capitalism, that what feels like the right decision is the one that confirms the bourgeois mindset: protect private property, preserve individual liberties, promote trade and commerce. The goal of gaining control of the state takes aim at this underlying level of laws, practices, and expectations, targeting common sense to make it the sense for and of the common. Capitalists will not voluntarily reorganize processes of accumulation so as to put an end to proletarianization. They will not simply hand over control and ownership of the means of production. States will not just stop oppressing, arresting, and imprisoning those who resist them. Such fundamental changes will only come about through political struggle, carried out internationally. A left that eschews organizing for power will remain powerless. This is why we are talking about the party again.